We good? All right, let's do it. Welcome everyone to the panel that is going to be, and by the way, I should say up front, thank you for choosing this instead of happy hour. But I think it's going to be a super important conversation and a really interesting one to talk about the Edtech equity challenges, closing the gap through learning science. Really distinguished panel that we have up here to talk about this. Immediately to my left, we have Vic Vucic, the Chief Innovation Officer and Executive Director of the Learner Variability Project at Digital Promise Global. And then next to him, we have Susan Enfield, the Superintendent at Highline Public Schools. And then we've got Liz Brooke, who is the Chief Learning Officer at Lexia Learning and Rosetta Stone. And then last but not least, we have Bruce McCandless, Professor of Education Psychology and Neuroscience at Stanford University. So this is going to be, I think, a very interesting conversation. And I'm just going to dive right in, Vic, which is, look, I've been writing around how education can benefit from technology for I've made a career out of this, around personalizing learning by serving people who were not well served in the beginning. What gives? Do you think, is that true, or do you think that we have an equity problem as education technology has exploded over the last decade?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question and an important question. I think it's something that I wrestle with. You know, I've been in this for over 10 years. I live in Menlo Park, the heart of Silicon Valley, and now I'm a tech optimist with, as many of them. But, I also have studied learning and learning science and worked with many schools and districts, and I've seen studies, plenty of studies and plenty of data coming in that I actually feel I could very defensively make the claim that actually in many cases, maybe you could even potentially say majority, don't know if we're that precise yet, but in many cases, EdTech is actually increasing gaps rather than decreasing them. And I will, I can highlight a few examples. Research from Dick Murnane at Harvard and Justin Reich at MIT, where they got all the data from a few major EdTech products and they mapped it to the districts and the zip codes, tied that to socioeconomic status. And then they looked at the intensity of use of the education technology products and how persistent and at what level of quality they developed designs of quality of use. And it was pretty clear that actually in lower income districts, much shorter use, much more superficial use. And at upper income districts, got a little nice.
Is it possible to turn the music down behind us?
Happy hour started next door, apparently.
No, we can't control that? Okay.
Slow jam.
All right, we can't control.
That's right.
Slow jam.
All right, the music is what the music is. All right, sorry. Yeah, keep going.
That's right.
Yeah.
But, and in more affluent districts, much richer use of the technologies, much richer products created out of the technologies, and much more persistent use throughout. And then on top of that, this really hit me a couple months ago. I was talking to an executive of one of the biggest EdTech companies, and he said his daughter missed something somewhere and then went on to a self-learning platform, and in 3 months completed the entire grade's worth of knowledge and curriculum, took the assessment, passed it, and completed the grade in 3 months, which is amazing and great. But then I think, well, this product, I'm pretty sure, doesn't have supports for academic language, for ELLs. It doesn't have supports for kids that struggle with reading. And so you think about all the other kids that are out there that may show nominal growth, little growth, no growth. Mm-hmm. And so you have this thing where a lot of times there's a bias I see designed towards self-directed learning, in which case kids often that are already doing well are going to jump in and accelerate. And then either nominal gains with a lot of other kids when you look at learner diversity more broadly and in other areas. And so, yes, it can, it's helping in many ways, but it could easily be increasing the gaps.
All right, so that's a provocative thought. And we have folks who've been working in this field for a long time as well. Susan, maybe I'll start with you, because you run a district that has been known for your blended learning work to personalize, not recognized by Digital Promise, Christensen Institute. A lot of folks have written about you. What's your take on this?
Yeah, so I would agree with a lot of what Vic said, and I think so. Just for a little bit of context, Highline is a richly diverse system serving just under 19,000 students, and our students speak well over 100 different languages and dialects. So I think for us, and I will say that every one of our children is brilliant, beautiful, and brimming with promise, and our children bring with them all of the challenges that are sadly just too common in urban school systems. So we have high rates of poverty, we have lots of trauma, all of those things that make learning more of a challenge for some of our students than in other districts in the region. That said, I think when we talk about equity in ed tech, for us it comes down to issues around access, around alignment, and around rigor. Those are sort of pain points that we feel. So obviously there's the access of, we have students who, if we don't give them the device, they won't have it. And at home, they don't have the support and the environment to make the best use of some of these tools and technologies that the district has invested in. So there's that sort of access point. And then because we have such a significant number of students who come to us speaking a language other than English, and Spanish is easy, right? Everybody does Spanish. But Vietnamese is my second biggest language, and after that it's Somali. And there's not a lot in the EdTech space with Somali for my Somali learners, and that's a significant part of our population. So the access piece runs in that direction too. And then when I talk with my team, and in preparing for this, we had a conversation, and as a school district that is known to try to be innovative and do things that really serve kids, we get approached on probably a weekly basis with somebody wanting to offer a free pilot or try this, try that, et cetera. And we've put together a team of teachers and district specialists that evaluate everything, and we look for alignment with Common Core standards and alignment with our Highline expectations, and for rigor. And a lot of times they fall short because we really do take a critical eye. So that alignment and rigor is something we feel is incredibly important. And Vic and I were talking earlier, it's be the last point I'll make and we can move on, but one of the things that one of the women on my team was telling me about prior to my coming here was that for some of the adaptive tools that our students use that are meant to scaffold so that they're more adaptive, they can over-scaffold. And the rigor, the students sort of hit a ceiling when it comes to rigor, so they're not really being pushed to achieve and learn at levels they really could because the program sort of cuts them off short. So that's a really high-level overview of one of our challenges.
Liz?
Yeah, so that last point about adaptivity that actually could be constraining is really interesting because at both Lexia and Rosetta Stone, our principle of adaptive blended learning is something that we're trying to, again, take what technology does best in the AI phenomenon that's happening right now, and then take HI, or the human intelligence, and connect those two with data. And a big part of that formula is the adaptivity. And so it's interesting to think about the way we think about adaptivity is branching and scaffolding, but then always needing to have them demonstrate mastery back up at that standard level. So when you're talking about Common Core, whether it's Texas state standards, so always making sure that although we're scaffolding and giving them that direct, explicit instruction, we are asking them or demanding that same rigor for them. So that's an interesting concept when adaptivity can go wrong, so to speak. But again, this idea of equity and taking neuroscience and the learning science, Lexia started over 30 years ago with a research grant from NICHD, and that's been a foundation. And one of the challenges, having been a teacher myself and then studying communication disorders and research, my challenge has always been, how do we take the research and bring it to the practical world of the schools? And so that's what we are always challenged with. How do we take what we know from research and combine that with what you're facing on a day-to-day basis and our teachers in the classroom?
Bruce, you've been researching this. What's your take?
I have like a number of different and conflicting opinions on this that kind of shift depending on what context I'm working on. In general, I'm a lot like Vic. I have this sense that there's incredible promise of taking all the insights from neuroscience, how the brain learns, how people learn, all of these great insights that we have, and embodying them in these educational technologies. But I think their true effectiveness is going to be when they're integrated with what's happening in the social milieu, when they're supporting what the teacher is doing and aligning and underscoring what the teacher is doing and helping to compound that goal that the teacher has. And there's evidence that actually supports this. So Chung and Slavin did a meta-analysis of 84 different randomized controlled studies. They used computer-aided design technology versus kind of business as usual. And 60,000 students participated in this study when you add it all up. And what they found is that computer-aided design, even though it did everything that everybody hoped it would, it added adaptivity, gave all this repeated trials, gave like lots of immediate feedback, and every single principle you'd want, the effect size was like, meh. Like, okay, 0.11 effect size is like, okay, a tenth of a standard deviation. This would be like, okay, we buy all this technology and we move the kids from the 50th percentile to maybe the 54th percentile. It's like, really? That was the big payoff of all this learning science being adapted through SUPES type technology and everything? But then they found in the meta-analysis something really fascinating, which was if you look at the degree to which the Edtech is just like its own little module, kind of that parachutes down and drops in out of context versus it's really integrated with what's happening in the teacher and the nonverbal interactions and everything, suddenly the effect size tripled and became 3 times as effective. It's the same stuff, but it's integrated. It's not interfering. You know, it's not like different information that you're learning in your supplemental compared to what you're supposed to be learning in your primary, and they're at odds and they're fighting with each other. So I think that the context matters a lot. But we can also zoom out and say, well, there's data on this. We can collect evidence on this, and you can scour the literature to say, well, what's the best evidence or what's the most recent evidence? And I think that the most informative evidence I could find on this very question, because you kind of put the question in my mind and I was like, well, how do I resolve this? The PISA study, 500,000 children, 15-year-olds from around the entire world, developed, undeveloped countries. There's recently been an analysis, if you just take the developed countries, because that might be a special context that's most relevant to us, take 22 developing countries, 140,000 kids surveyed in their mathematical achievement. And it turns out that if you ask the question, what was their access to educational technology? It was powerfully related to their achievement. And then if you ask, well, who's benefiting from this the most? In general, if you just look at indicators of socioeconomic status, it turns out that the kids with the lowest socioeconomic status are benefiting the most from this access to technology. And then you ask, well, how is it interacting with other social contextual variables? And it turns out something really interesting happens that pulls in 2 different directions that's kind of confusing. In one sense, if you look at schools that have challenges in terms of a lack of qualified teachers, it turns out that in those schools, there's a risk factor. If you have fewer qualified teachers, your math scores really, really suffer. If you combine that with lack of access to this kind of educational technology, it's like this multiplicative risk factor. They're compounded, they're interacting. So if you're at a school that has a lack of qualified teachers, and you happen to be in one of those schools that has a lack of access to educational technology, you're in the worst possible position. You're getting not just a double whammy, but like a multiplicative whammy. And then the other thing is, at home, the opposite thing happens. So access to computers at home is also positively related to academic achievement, to math achievement, but in the presence of a highly educated parent, it multiplies. It takes off. If you look at computer use at home in the presence of a highly educated parent, the use is strategic, the use is focused, it's disciplined, it's kind of like really well focused on particular sort of points, and the impact of having access is like multiplied. And so these contextual factors matter a lot, and I think we have to take these into the design process. When we say, let's design educational technology, I say, don't start by ignoring the context and say, we're going to build a perfect module that we can drop in anywhere. I say, design for the social context, because that's where most of the action is.
So that literally, you all started off on a somewhat depressing note, and then I expected actually, Liz and Susan were gonna, go at you, Vic, and say no. And Bruce, you brought us to a little bit more of a positive note, I think, in the remarks. But I guess my curiosity then is this, which is you have the. It seemed to me that one of the reasons that we really have to figure out the context in school environments specifically is this home dynamic, right? Which there's a lot of research emerging that in low socioeconomic communities that have, in some cases, more access, frankly, to technology than in upper income, particularly mobile variety, they're not using it for educational purposes. And so the use case is not benefiting this, whereas when it is used in upper income, you see a very different behavior. And therefore, my sense has been, well, schools have to be the epicenter of figuring out how do you integrate this. So I'm curious if you're feeling like, gosh, we're getting tools or we're not getting tools to serve, Somali students or whatever else. How are you coping with that? What's your solution? You obviously haven't been of the attitude, we're just going to keep it all out.
Right.
You're a thoughtful integrator of it somehow. What does that look like?
Well, I think that for my team and me in Highline, there's a huge family engagement component around this that I think we don't talk about enough, because especially in districts like mine that serve significantly large immigrant and refugee populations where the families may not be as adept at using the tools as others, I think helping give them tools to better make use of the technology. But I also think helping our teachers help make meaning of the tools that we're giving kids, and so that they're integrating it during the day in the classroom, and that whatever the children are doing at home is somehow connected with that, right? So that there's not just this artificial divide where I'm in school during the day and I get this and I go home and then it's a free-for-all. And I think our teachers are getting much more thoughtful about how they plan for what students do in their outside of class learning. And that's where the tools become critical.
Yeah, I think it's actually an interesting point that is somewhat of a diversion, but this idea of teacher knowledge, and I'll speak specifically to reading right now, but the amount of teachers who understand the science of reading, and so also not only helping them understand how it fits into their current context of what they're doing, but understanding the why behind the technology and the why behind it. So Vic, you mentioned academic language. That's one of the strongest predictors. So syntactic knowledge, morphological knowledge, and a lot of teachers don't understand the power of that. And so therefore the implementation and the integration, right? So that's why this blended approach in taking the technology and blending it into what is happening is important, but also helping the teachers understand the context of the why and understanding where they need to focus their efforts. And again, depending on talking about equity in terms of low language kids or ELs, whatever it might be. So that is another piece that comes into play is how many teachers were taught how to integrate technology, let alone drive data or drive instruction through data, right? These are all challenges that come along with technology. So you not only have to think of building the research-based technology, but thinking about the implementation support and thinking about how it fits into their current context. So it's not just one more thing we do Monday morning, but it's integrated into their learning model in the classroom.
So what do we do about that? Because training, that's that's an enormous problem. Training teachers, that's been a long-standing problem, independent of the technology question.
Right.
How do you all think about that?
You can build some of that actually into the technology.
So say more.
So you're not only scaffolding the instruction for the students, but actually teaching, embedding that professional development for the teachers. For example, there's 6 syllable types. I don't know if you all knew that, but there's 6 syllable types. Or there's a doubling rule, why you double a consonant at the end when you're adding a suffix. And teachers learn that through the technology that we're building for the students. We also obviously provide professional development for the teachers. We provide instructional resources that are scripted for those who need it. And for those who don't, they can get a great word list or whatever. but it's building that into, again, not only your product services, but building in some of that pedagogical training, not just product training. And I think that's part on us as education technology providers is to help with that. And again, it's not just a product that you drop in, drop out. It's a partnership with these schools.
And so I'm actually straight down the line. I mean, how would you start to tackle this, like as you look at the research?
Well, I think that if you want to really focus on inequities, we have to really study it as a specific kind of entity that we have to take on kind of like straight on in a way. I mean, 1 in 5 children in this country are living in poverty, and they're being educated in poverty, and they're going to schools that are impoverished in many, many ways, and many other children are going into schools that have all sorts of compounding factors working kind of in their favor. They're going to schools in which there's tremendous parent support, tremendous kind of peer pressure for success and expectations for success, qualified teachers, and kind of a positive learning environment. And then on top of that, we're trying to mix in educational technology. I think that we need to have use cases of where is technology actually working in the context of impoverished schools in order to have a dynamic effect on all of these things and have a positive effect. I think this is a design challenge, and I think it needs to be met as a design challenge rather than saying, oh, we've got this technology, it's working really well for this demographic, and this demographic, oh, it's only working half as well or not at all. Shrug. You know, I think we have to go and tackle this as a design problem.
Yeah, if I can just add on that, I think that's one of the things, and even as we think about efficacy and in the research context, you know, in Edtech, often if you get a positive effect with 70% of kids, that's actually a really good result, you know, and amazing. But then I always ask myself, well, what about the other 30%? And if I scale that, 55 million kids, that's 16 million kids. Yep. You can't just be like, oh, someone else is going to deal with that. You know, it's how do we really push that and bring that discipline into the design process, the evaluation process, and vetting process. And I will say one thing I am fairly bullish about is kind of what Liz mentioned, where it's the technology really integrating and supplementing the human intelligence, right? And I think we've seen some studies and some of Carol Connor's work and others where the technology supports the teacher in personalizing and understanding. And part of the challenge is, you know, the technology, the easy thing is the technology tells the teacher what to do. But how do you then weave in a little bit of the background knowledge so that they then know why, and they build and grow through that process? And I think not oversimplifying, but, you know, taking a balanced approach is really something I'm quite bullish on.
Do you look for that, Susan, when you're like, and what does that look like when you're looking at products?
Yeah, so when our team evaluates something new to come in, and frankly also when we monitor the effectiveness of an implementation over time and make the hard decision sometimes to move away from something that we've been using because we're not seeing the effectiveness over time with kids, the notion of the opportunities for teachers to learn and improve their practice relative to that product is really important for us. So it's about access, rigor, and alignment for kids, but it's also about support for teachers in integrating that into what we're already doing. And I think that the district has a role in putting the conditions in place and helping to make meaning for staff over all of the things. Right there, they're flooded with different products and things all the time. And I think the role that the district plays, and the way I frame it, and I just had this conversation last week with someone, it isn't a matter about district control, it's about district responsibility. And I think districts have a responsibility to help put the conditions in place for teachers to make good use of these things, right? Not just procure, but also implement smartly and with good supports for teachers.
So what are some of those conditions that you as you start to think about this from a design challenge, right? And what are some of the key factors you would be looking at? Because poverty is too high a grain size to be meaningful, obviously, in starting to design. How would you start to frame the questions?
So I think that partnerships between researchers and the people who are designing educational technologies are an incredibly powerful potential mix in which the researchers have very particular insights about like what are some of the biggest factors going on that impact, you know, children in poverty, what are some of the biggest threats, what's shutting down their learning, what's helping them to kind of belong, what innovations are seeming to take root. And the problem is that this research is typically not that easy to kind of bring to scale. But when people are designing educational technologies, there's a possibility of doing something that I think is really a powerful combination, and that is getting a whole bunch of precise data on individual children over time and doing that at scale. So this is, in a sense, a gold mine for data research, for learning, sort of adapting and trying out principles and getting feedback data on them. And then I think that if you have this iterative design cycle in which cohort after cohort of students are going through this infrastructure, you can see repeated patterns and you can lead to systematic improvements year by year. But I think it takes this kind of enduring partnership.
And I was going to say that's something we do at Lexia and Rosetta Stone, this ongoing partnership in data analysis of, as you said, millions of students, millions of data points. The one thing, and then also working with Digital Promise and the Learner Variability Project and looking at the research factors in the different models and that iterative process. My question or my challenge around research in the schools, and you talked about all those variables that we know are impacting, right, poverty and language levels and all these factors, and we have this database and we can certainly run analyses, but when you're looking to isolate and determine which variables, right, in the treatment and control, and working with schools and the idea of how do we have a control group who doesn't get, right, the treatment, right? So I'd be curious, both Susan and Bruce, your idea, because we are all about partnering with researchers, independent researchers as well as in-house researchers, and working with schools and districts, but that's a challenge of how do we do that?
Yeah. So I don't think that research is necessarily at odds with like helping children or treating children ethically. There's lots of sort of natural discontinuity studies that you can carry out that look at beautiful effects. You know, we bifurcate the population based on exactly their birthday. My son was born on August 30th, and the day he was born has a huge impact on when he will enter kindergarten or when he'll spend an entire extra school year. I mean, treated radically differently, and people can use that as a way to see, well, what's the impact of that, right? You know, an entire year, that's like 1/4 of his life. He's only 4. So the school system is like arbitrarily like treating my kid differently on something that's impacting 25% of his entire lifespan at this point. And this turns out to have really big systematic effects. If you're in a really high quality school system, it turns out it has almost no effect at all if you're in a really low quality school system. So you can start to use these discontinuities to look at patterns in data if you have the data. But the data that researchers get from schools is often really quite limited. It's as if you're trying to understand what a movie is happening and having a 4-year-old kind of narrate it to you, kind of like every minute or so. You got some idea what's going on, but the trend, it's not exactly the resolution you'd like. So I think that there's this incredible opportunity to sort of collect this data and to see these patterns happening. We know that there's a lot of cognitive variables that are highly predictive of what kind of challenges you're going to have in reading. We can give you kind of a cumulative risk factor for being diagnosed with dyslexia, 4 or 5 years into the future, and it's like 80% accurate. But when we cross that with social inequities, it turns out that having any one of these risk factors is multiplied if you're in a low SES environment. Socioeconomic status and cognitive risk factors for reading failure are not just things that add together, they multiply together. It puts you in kind of a double jeopardy situation. I think within a school context, we can design around that. We can give kids exactly what they need, exactly when they need it, in a very agile way if we've got the right data infrastructure to watch each one of their trajectories as they go from being a pre-reader to breaking through and having different struggles and battles on different stages of learning to read. And I think the educational technology has tremendous adaptivity to give the kids exactly what they need, exactly when they need it.
In terms of partnerships, Susan, do you do partnerships with companies? And what would be the challenges from a research perspective? I would
Yes.
imagine privacy and would be a huge one.
Privacy is a huge issue for a lot of our families now, and frankly, obviously, we're bound by FERPA and all those things that make some of, I think, the potential partnerships problematic, but they're not insurmountable, right? I mean, it is doable. I think sometimes our folks can get a little myopic. And the fear factor comes into play before they really sit back and evaluate whether or not this particular research partnership could work. So I often find myself pushing my folks a little bit to say, I don't think we need to say no so quickly. But it's also a capacity issue. I mean, people and our staff in schools are stretched, and to take this on is in addition to what we're already asking them to do every day with kids. So I think it's both a capacity, a fear factor, and an ability to do it right, because I don't think we do it right a lot of the
I
times.
think that's a great point. I mean, I've talked to so many companies that have like this good faith intention of wanting to partner with research and wanting to like make sense of their data so they can iteratively improve their product. And then the reality comes of like, well, where's the budget for that? Where are the personnel for that? Where's the infrastructure for that? And the researchers have the same problem, right? We're supposed to be carrying out our research program, but where's the infrastructure for figuring out how we're going to take this data set of like 10,000 children and organize it and sort of clean it and systematize it and pull out the variables that we need? So I think there's kind of a need for this kind of third-party bridging infrastructure. And I think that some groups are starting to emerge that are going to be kind of interstitial between these groups and help them collaborate to a greater good.
Who would you point to that's starting to emerge in that?
Digital Promise.
Great. So that was a good segue.
I would point to the National Science Foundation. I would point to like other kind of data repositories that are sort of growing for,
Cool.
Emerson Collective has been launching a number of these kind of like partnerships to study. The Oak Foundation has been supporting some of this.
Yep.
But, yeah.
And so Vic, I was going to say, I mean, I'm curious your take on this question as well. I'm also curious because you're partnering with a lot of companies right now to take the insights that you've pulled together to help them actually improve product. So I'm curious your sort of view on both the receptivity of partnership on both sides and how you'd put it together.
Yes, there's a lot in that question.
Yes, and it's purposely loaded. Yeah.
So let me start with the data side, data capacity, and it is something we've been working on, and I do think, I mean, we have a prototype. I think it's completely feasible to get much lighter weight, much more, I mean, with the cloud and all these tools that are so inexpensive, so scalable now, that we've put in protections for privacy and control for the right people, and blended in collaborative analysis tools that in 2 or 3 days we can actually bring in large data sets and do analyses really rapidly. So I think that reduces the cost. You still have the human elements. I think one good example is like San Francisco, and I think there's an opportunity for regional funders, like regional foundations, to be part of the capacity building, provide some of that funding for this region to understand, because it's contextual, right? Like let's support some of the capacity in this for this context, and then they can provide some of the resources to do that. Kind of shifting to the products and how we've been working with product developers and integrating the learning science into their design process. I think overall receptivity, everybody has really great intent and wants to. There's nobody that's like, no, we don't want to, integrate learning science and support more learners.
That's a good. Yeah, I suspect there are people not at this conference who would not believe that. So,
so that's good. And then we talk. The hard part is, there is some complexity to it. There is no silver bullet or magic bullet. I think one of the lower hanging fruits where I think there is building momentum, and actually Lexia has stepped into this, is actually. Often people don't think of integrating social-emotional learning into academic products. Like, yes, you may have a separate growth mindset product, but like, what does growth mindset mean for reading, right? Or sense of belonging while you're learning math? And how do you design for that in a product intentionally? And I think that SEL area, and the thing is when you get into poverty and a lot of these underserved populations, this is actually a huge, huge element. I think I'm rather hopeful that seeing products starting to pay more attention, moving in this direction, and some of our resources are making this easier, better, faster to do, that it takes that more holistic lens to the design of EdTech that can support and hopefully close some of these gaps as for diverse learners.
So I want to stay on this diverse learners piece specifically and think about, as we think about the gap, and just go one level deeper, because we sort of carved it along some national lines, we've carved it along some income lines, I imagine we would carve it along some race lines. I'm curious though, you have a view of the research along a variety of heuristics that suggests, treating different learners in different ways based on very specific characteristics. What are you most worried about right now is getting overlooked?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I would almost defer to, you can get ready for this one, because I think Bruce, I would ask Bruce. No, just kidding. I think, let's see, if I was kind of thinking through, there is nuance and complexity, I think, in terms of, the executive function piece is really, really important, and I think there's a lot more variability in that than our research suggests, and a lot more compounding kind of effects overall. And, I can even take, my dog.
Can you break that down?
So executive function is actually, what's interesting is it's general to all learning. Learning anything, I use my working memory. I use sensory processing. I use attention and focus, right? And those all kind of feed into that. But certain ones matter more depending on what you're learning. Certain ones matter more for reading, and other ones matter more for math and other things. But I think, and unfortunately, traditionally, these have often been, labeled as learning differences or dyslexia. But really, it's a much broader continuum than I think we recognize, and that we design for, and that we support. And it flows. And even I take the example of my daughter, who's, not diagnosed with a learning difference, but she clearly, we have had her assessed. She has variability on a couple of these things, and it really impacts, with certain experiences, she has tremendous growth. In certain experiences, she completely flatlines and completely disengaged, and it's really impactful. And so I think that's kind of an area of kind of both development and I think it's compounded by poverty and difficult contexts that kids grow up in, and has a tremendous effect. And so that's where I would like to see a lot more attention and growth, and kind of knowledge for people being able to understand if something is good at supporting executive function or not. Because I think that's where a lot of people don't have an idea of this would support kids that struggle with executive function or not. We're fairly nascent in that.
So executive function is kind of an interesting construct it came really from psychology and neuropsychology about how does the mind work, what are the mechanisms of the mind. There's been tremendous growth in the neurosciences of understanding how do we control our own thoughts? How do we switch between tasks or build task hierarchies? And how do we do all of these control type aspects that we think about as being a really important part of having a healthy mind? But interestingly, this construct has been taking off in educational circles. If you look at Google Ngrams for the term executive function, it's like creeping along and bouncing along, and then suddenly it's like taking off exponentially. This is like something that's really becoming part of our kind of currency and lexicon in education. There's all sorts of interesting findings that if you measure a kid's executive function early on in kindergarten and pre-K, it's a really big predictor of their academic success, like 3 and 5 years into the future. There's also some kind of challenging aspects that if you look at kids that are in a low resourced environment, like low SES context versus high SES context, there's a really big difference in terms of their executive function performance across these things for a lot of really, really interesting reasons. So there's almost an inequity, even in first grade, between executive function skills. These are linked to differences in brain development. When we look at the impact of poverty or socioeconomic status on brain development, it's found to be a pretty significant modulator of human brain development. And it gets worse, or it gets more dramatic the more extreme the poverty. So Seth Pollack just had this beautiful study come out in JAMA where he shows that the cortical thickness in the frontal lobe of children can be predicted by their socioeconomic status. And as you come down to being like 150% of the poverty line, the cortical thickness is like 4% less than the typical population average. As you go down below 100% of the poverty line and even below, it doubles to like 10% of the difference from normal. So these kind of like sociological inequities are having a profound impact on who we are, even at a neural level. And from a perspective of human brain development, this is something that just absolutely has to be addressed. We have to find ways of providing kind of like more kind of like growth-philic, growth-supportive environments for these children to kind of grow and thrive and survive.
And can I just add one quick thing that does concern me is, someone just mentioned this and it really dawned on me, we have to be careful that executive function doesn't become the new IQ.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
That could be a real bad unintended consequence. And so it's more about designing environments, it's developmental, and how do we frame it appropriately so that it doesn't go the wrong way.
I like to think of executive function as a set of broad individual differences that we have to adapt education toward.
Yep.
I think that when we miss kind of like getting a child's in a zone of proximal development and heavy engagement and processing and continuation and kind of like appetitive engagement in an academic process, I think often if you get the executive function demands wrong for that kid, if they're like too boring or like they're way too challenging, then you've kind of lost the whole game. Mm-hmm. But if you tune it at just the right level and you adapt it to a child's executive function kind of like zone of proximal development, you get huge engagement. You get these flow experiences and everything. Lynn Fuchs had this beautiful study in which she had 2 different math curricula, and she wanted to know which one was better than business as usual. And she ran this really big population study and found that both of them had kind of a medium-sized effect, and there was no difference in effect size between them. But when she looked in terms of working memory within each of these populations, she found that in intervention A, the kids with the lowest working memory were benefiting the most from intervention A. And when she looked at intervention B, the kids with the highest working memory were getting the biggest bang for the buck. So it turns out that your learning environment has to be really well matched to the executive function demands that are supported.
Yeah.
And I was just going to say what you said, Vic, about people not understanding about executive function or even understanding. So for example, in our program at Lexia, one of the branching is around working memory, but people might not even realize that's what the scaffold is on. So instead of just hearing the phrase that they have to match to a picture, that's standard step, and then they branch to practice, and the picture's actually there while they're hearing the phrase, so they don't hold the phrase in their working memory. Or inhibition and putting a check mark where they have to submit their answers. There are subtleties in programs that are trying to address executive function, but that goes back to teacher knowledge and districts evaluating programs, and are those even elements of your rubrics, right? Like, do you have rubrics that look at not only the reading pedagogy and the engagement, but elements of working memory, attention, right, inhibition, all of those things? Like, is that?
Well, and I think I want to add to what Bruce said. I think really sort of bringing home what we know about the brain and the impacts of poverty on the brain. You know, for those of us who have devoted our lives to K12 education, you know, our mantra is poverty is not a learning disability, but it certainly can be. Right. But I think that the research that you're citing makes the case for why this conversation is so critically important. Mm-hmm. Because if we can figure out how to overcome these equity challenges, you know, through Edtech and partnerships and research in schools, we can truly prevent poverty from becoming a learning disability. Yeah. But until we do this, it's not.
And I worry about using the term poverty as just like a category, because I think what happens when I really try to like look at the research on poverty, what you typically see is just really large increased variability. And in general, we all know that children have a lot of vulnerabilities, and that under situations of high resources, those vulnerabilities can be sort of treated and prevented and supported. But under low resource, these become tremendous risk factors that can have sort of lifelong implications if they're not sort of targeted and treated and supported. So I think that this is where I would hope that educational technology, collaboration between researchers and people who are doing kind of like intervention at scale can really collaborate to find kids that are in jeopardy, in educational jeopardy, for really particular reasons that we can figure out and give them exactly the supports that they need. That's kind of the hope, and not just trying to treat poverty as a thing, but like saying, well, if you're in an impoverished environment, you've got a risk factor, and you're in an impoverished environment, you've got a multiplied risk factor, and we need to come in and rescue that situation with great urgency.
So this is super helpful along a number of dimensions. I'm glad you guys are also breaking down concepts that can just be sort of categories in the same way that cancer used to be a category, and we now know that there's lots of different molecular processes undergoing something that we've given a common phrase. With the time remaining, I want to tackle one last topic, which I think is going to become a bigger and bigger deal. It's already becoming bigger at this conference, which means in a couple years it'll be overhyped, which is artificial intelligence and machine learning in education. And what are your hopes for that? Because I think you could imagine, well, gee, if the algorithm is learning from itself, it could pick up some of these things and maybe surface them for designing. But I also would imagine that there are bias risks in this. And so where do you all think that will come at them? It's a bit of a lightning round, I guess, on this question. But I love your take and your optimism or lack thereof on this, and what you perceive as the biggest risks if you're worried. Who wants to jump in with that one first?
You want to go first?
All right, Liz. Yeah, let's do it.
Sure. Well, as I started saying, I think AI is great for a lot of things, and we've talked about this before, that the idea of whether it's social emotional learning, or there's elements that AI just can't capture to understand. Did the student not have breakfast that morning? Did the parents just get divorced? Whatever it might be. And then that connection, that relationship, there is research around, students are less likely to drop out. There was a study done by Catherine Snow around the likelihood of dropping out of high school and some of the factors that impact that. And one of them was having an adult that believed in them, right? So that idea of taking technology to do the repetition, doing the adapting, doing the meeting the students where they are, and then empowering that educator with the data to do what educators do best, right? And that's connect and build that relationship and understand and adapt. And you could get recommendations, right? I think we've talked about this before on Netflix, right? And
Yeah.
I don't know what algorithm they're using, but sometimes I'm like, that's not really my type of movie. So we want to be careful and use the power of machine learning and AI, but not forget the HI and the human intelligence. But the power of the data and this ongoing progress monitoring of blending those two together is my hope for the future.
Bruce?
I think that AI is generally overhyped, and I don't think that most of the time we use that term, we have a really precise thing in mind about what we mean by that. If you take these highly recurrent neural networks that can sort of train and see patterns, they're pattern detectors. And I think that the use of a pattern detector, if you're working with a school district in a data blizzard, to pull out some really kind of like useful patterns that might be recurring, and might be really, really useful and might be actionable, I would have the hope that we can use this kind of technology and pattern detection to answer the question, what is going to work and for whom? So we have all of these different toolkits, all these different interventions, all of these different approaches, and each one of them works really, really well for some children and really not so well for other children. If we can know ahead of time, if we know enough about a child that knows that, if we put them through this path of learning technology or this particular school or this particular environment, that the prognosis is really weak, but it's much more hopeful over here. This is actionable knowledge that we can take advantage of. And I think that within school data, if you look at the progression of a kid from pre-K all the way up into, let's say, 8th grade or 9th grade or 10th grade, if you've got data trails that are happening cohort after cohort within a school district, there are really vivid patterns there. We can predict, based on kindergarten, which children are going to wind up being diagnosed with dyslexia kind of 4 years in the future. And the patterns are there, and we can use those patterns and we can act on those patterns, and that's my hope.
I would share that. I think the potential for far greater precision in how we diagnose and intervene in helping get kids where they need to be on their learning trajectory, but I think also there's tremendous power in helping us as systems of scale do what I think we don't do a good job of at all, which is making sure that every student is on track without tracking them, right? And if we have that kind of precise, actionable data that allows us to make sure that kids are on track without, adults saying, oh, you're going to be on track A, you're going to be on track B, that would be a powerful, powerful thing for us to have.
Vic, bring us home.
Well, I have a bias, so I'll say, I could be cautiously optimistic. I think a key element, especially in this early years of AI, is keeping the human element integrated into that. Just putting a box out there and just interacting directly, we're not ready for that, and we won't be for a number of years. The other piece is this kind of lens of learner variability, having this whole child lens and understanding how that AI plays out through that diversity. And I've seen AI engines tell English language learners that they're wrong when they're right, at scary scale. It's happening. And so really being thoughtful about that diversity and the edges, and that we are responsible for testing and designing through that as we move into the AI kind of era.
So some solutions out there that we've talked about, some notes of optimism at the end, and some appropriate cautions as well. Please join me in thanking the panelists.